The UK government has given out enough money to give £20,000 to every single adult in the country. Not every single household, every single adult. All of you, all of your parents, all of your siblings, all of your friends, £20,000 each. Do we know who has that money now?
Okay. You can't be right all the time?
I mean, you can't be right all the time, but I think it is possible to understand the economy. Not completely, not perfectly. But I mean, is it possible for a doctor to make a right diagnosis? Is it possible for a car mechanic to fix your car?
But those are fundamentally different things. Because a car is a closed system machine, and we understand the chemistry and the mechanics of a machine so that it won't change its mind, right? A diesel engine doesn't suddenly decide to be the fairy queen, right? I mean, we understand all its properties, and it's highly predictable, and the range of errors are also completely predictable. Human society is not like that because we're imaginative, and we live in incredibly complex, interdependent systems that are themselves ever-changing. So it is a kind of, it's an aspiration to, well, even religion has more humility than that, because major religions of the world say, like St. Paul, we see through a glass darkly, right? They don't claim to be a science. Mainstream economics is extraordinary. It sort of claims to be, I mean, economists who use it know that it's a thought experiment. The real problem is when politicians believe it and say, we've got the answer.
Yeah. I look forward to Rachel Reeves telling us that her next prediction is a thought experiment.
She should.
Let's move on to the last theme, which is what do we think we should do in order to, across the panels, acceptance that economic theory has obviously made lots of mistakes, or the way that we've understood the economy, lots of mistakes over the last decade or two, maybe a great deal longer than that. But what should we do now to change that situation so that we do it better in future?
If your question is to give up on the idea that any economic model or forecast is viable, then I think that's a mistake. I think if we use no forecasting at all, it will, one, I think, generate further uncertainty, further volatility. The policy-making process then could become much more grounded in political ideology, and that would worry me.
But it just in a purely economic, from an economic point of view, you would accept that a very large proportion of economists, including the Bank of England and the Treasury, got the predictions about the inflation wildly wrong and maintained getting it wrong, even though there were an increasing number of voices saying this is a mistake. And what do you think should be done now in the sense of our economic understanding? What should change in the light of that empirical evidence that the theory didn't work, it didn't predict the right stuff, and we got it wildly wrong?
So a couple of things on that, and I think I referred to it earlier. The bit that, and I'm not making excuses here, but the black swan moment was Putin deciding to invade Ukraine, right? And he kept reassuring the world that he was never going to do this. That was not his intention, and all of our intelligence was coming and saying exactly the opposite, and we tried very hard with him to say, do not do this. But war on our continent is a pretty big deal, and it actually drove much of the inflation that you saw. Of course, the response to the pandemic, which I think was the right one, by the way, to protect people's wages and protect businesses. We've had a massive scarring effect on the economy because the majority of businesses that would have gone under, not the large cap, it would have been the small businesses that would have absolutely collapsed if we hadn't intervened the way we had done. But the one other thing that I think did fuel inflation is obviously the pandemic in China and how China handled the pandemic on supply chains. And then beyond that, the sort of political tension between China and NATO. So all of that, I think, is...
And QE?
And of course, and I mentioned that right at the outset. before people berated me for it.
Okay, I mean,
Thank you. I think we don't need to think in binary terms. Just because we don't know everything doesn't mean we know nothing. And neoclassical economics has its uses. Contract theory is really interesting about how if people have different information, as they sign a contract with someone else, they're systematically at a disadvantage over time. All that kind of stuff's pretty useful and pretty interesting. But it's one way of looking at the world with a lot of other very useful ways of looking at the world that are much more grounded in reality and are not based on fundamental utopian assumptions, which mathematical neoclassical economics is, the most utopian of which is the most fundamental assumption, which is that we're all rational cost-benefit maximizing individuals, that we operate on a single plane of value, right? I mean, I don't know, does that describe you? I don't think it describes me. So we're trying to conform to this blueprint based in this kind of two-dimensional space. And if we feel like we're ever less three-dimensional, ever less joyful, ever less imaginative, that's because we're trying to conform to this two-dimensional utopia that can't work. So I think we should go to analytical pluralism. You know, we shouldn't abandon neoclassical economics entirely. But like any other science, we should bring in a whole bunch of other theories, but we should start being empirical. We should start looking at the economy as it is, poverty being one of the... Poverty and the ecological crisis, I would say, are the two overriding calamities of our time, and they're not unconnected. So we should focus on those. And then we should think about what do we want the world to look like? You know, because it is political, social purpose, the things we choose are independently causative in the world. The world is not a computable system. It's not pre-established and we're just trying to navigate our way with forecasts in it. It's something that we're making and remaking all the time, and we can remake it for the better or the worse. And I think as soon as we realize that we can use lots of different theories, we can have lots of different purposes, what an incredibly liberating idea that is. I mean, and it has the merit of being true.
The strange thing is that in some ways that's quite similar to what Nadhim was saying, wasn't it? In the sense of he wants to operate with the models that we're doing at the moment. He doesn't think, a single overall one. And just think, okay, we got it wrong. We need to try and tinker with our models to see whether we can get it closer in the future.
But I think the fixation on thinking if we get the model right, or we could use AI, it's like Soviet cybernetics in the 1960s. If we just get the right methodology, we can give up this exhausting curiosity about the world and this exhausting need to make moral decisions, and we can lay back and give up responsibility, and the whole clockwork cosmos will work beautifully for us. It is such a rabbit hole, and we are all the way down the bottom. And so I think just as an analytical stance, if you say the world is not computable, and so forecasting, interesting thought experiment, it's not what we ought to be sort of focusing on. Society is an ecosystem like any other ecosystem. We're creatures like any other creatures. The economy is much more like a garden than a watch. If you think in those terms, it changes the entire nature of what you think you're doing in the world when you run a company, or you set up an SME, or you teach children, or you do any of the things that, keep us going. And so let's get away from small dreams of electric sheep and forecasting what the electric sheep are going to do, and start thinking about how do we want society to look, and what are the immediate problems, and how can we solve them. And let's do it on the understanding not that there is a kind of clerisy of economists who have unique access to wisdom and the interpretation of the world. And remember that all our knowledge, all our experience is absolutely relevant. We won't solve anything unless we remember that we have collective intelligence. Bring a lot of different voices into the room. You have as much knowledge as you can ever attain about how to solve the problem in front of you. So let's get away from, engineers of human souls, because boy, do they get it wrong.
Gary.
Well, I mean, I've got a very clear theory about what is happening in our specific economy now, our specific problem. I don't claim for it to be some grand central theory of economics forever. I think wealth inequality has increased very quickly. It continues to increase very quickly. Inequality in living standards continues to increase very quickly. Just to explain to you, Nadhim Zahawi mentioned the 450 billion pounds of QE. Do you know what the total UK government deficit is since the beginning of COVID?
Do tell us.
Does anyone know? Total UK government deficit. It's £1 trillion. Do you know what that is per UK adult? It's £20,000 per UK adult. The UK government has given out enough money to give £20,000 to every single adult in the country. Not every single household, every single adult. All of you, all of your parents, all of your siblings, all of your friends, £20,000 each. Do we know who has that money now? Are you all £20,000 richer, cash? Honestly, the most amazing thing I've ever witnessed in my life was that the US number is 10 trillion. All of the governments in the world gave out unbelievably enormous amounts of money. Nobody, not the Conservatives, not Labour, not Oxford University, not the think tanks, even asked who is going to end up £1 trillion richer. Nobody even asked that. It's so amazing, it's nearly beautiful. These are people who are very well educated, very prestigious. They didn't even ask the question. Listen, I'm going to be very clear. I've got a very clear objective here. If you do not stop, I'm not even talking about reducing inequality. If you do not stop inequality from rising enormously rapidly, we literally paused the economy, gave the richest people in the country £1 trillion, and were surprised when living standards fell. It's unbelievable. You need to stop inequality from rising. And what that means for a grand theory of economics, I don't really care. I want my friends to be able to feed their children. And you need to stop inequality from rising if you want to achieve that.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.